love you. The moon and all this decay reminds us to do those things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because striving for a difficult goal helps us organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and determined to win, along with the many other endeavors we pursue. Those were the words of President John F. Kennedy in 1961. My name is Patrick Moore. Throughout the years of the Apollo program, I had the privilege of presenting all the live coverage on British television. In the video you're about to see, you will witness the history of the Apollo missions. I am standing in the Space Gallery at the Science Museum in London, prepared to guide you through this extraordinary story. Here, amid one of the finest space exhibits outside the United States, we will take time to explore many of the remarkable artifacts that bring to life the saga of humanity's first voyages to the moon. In 1961, Kennedy spoke to the United States Congress declaring, "I believe that this nation should commit itself before this decade is out to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." These were bold words indeed. Yet it was actually the Soviet Union that had ignited the space age in October 1957 by launching Sputnik 1, the very first artificial satellite. It was the Soviet Union that sent the first unmanned probe to the moon in 1959, capturing the first photographs of its far side. And it was the Soviet Union that put the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit around Earth. Nevertheless, Kennedy gave the United States fewer than 10 years to place the first people on the moon and bring them safely home. This was the birth of Apollo. Astronauts were chosen to carry out these missions. The original 7 included Alan Shepard, but notably not Neil Armstrong. Meanwhile, scientific exploration of the moon pressed forward. Again, it was the Russians who achieved the first automated controlled landing on the lunar surface. Soon after, however, the American Surveyor probes arrived on the scene, conducting similar unmanned landings. More importantly, the Lunar Orbiter missions circled the moon and sent back detailed images of its entire surface. Before these missions, some had worried about encountering a thick, treacherous layer of lunar dust. But Surveyor dispelled these fears. The great dark plains on the moon, still often called seas, though devoid of water, proved firm enough to support a spacecraft's weight. Though the moon has no air, no one found evidence of anything biologically harmful. Its striking mountainous landscapes lay in silent anticipation of humanity's arrival. In the United States, prominent figures joined the effort, including Wernher von Braun, who had worked on the V-2 rockets at Peenemünde in Germany during World War II. He brought unmatched expertise to the American rocket team. High above where I stand in the Science Museum hangs an example of his earlier work, an actual V-2 rocket. Slowly, the lunar project became an international venture, although the Soviet Union kept its distance as it was developing its own lunar landing program. Eventually, the Russians had to cancel their plans when it became painfully clear that they lacked rockets sufficiently powerful to meet the task. Meanwhile, American orbital satellites became increasingly sophisticated. Astronauts performed spacewalks and orbital maneuvers, building skills that would be essential for a round-trip journey to the moon. More and more astronauts joined the program, including 3 who would make history: Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. In Earth orbit, or en route to the moon, weightlessness becomes a fact of life. Fears about uncontrollable nausea or disorientation proved largely unfounded. Likewise, concerns that tiny meteoroids might strike the spacecraft at high velocity did not materialize into a crippling hazard. By 1967, all was proceeding according to schedule. Then disaster struck on January 22nd of that year. 3 Apollo astronauts, Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee, were performing a routine ground test inside an Apollo module when a sudden cry of fire was heard. Nothing could be done to save them. They became America's first spaceflight casualties, and sadly would not be the last. Yet the dedication of NASA, the American Space Agency, was such that, less than 2 years after this tragedy, Apollo was ready to move forward once more. A moon mission is not as simple as one might imagine. You cannot simply blast off, fly directly to the moon in a single vehicle, land, and then come straight back in that same craft. First, a massive booster rocket is required for launch. Once liftoff occurs, the enormous thrust propels the spacecraft beyond Earth's atmosphere and onward. After the lower booster stages drop away, the upper section continues. During flight, the astronauts live and work in the command module, which also serves as their transport home. Once they reach lunar orbit, 2 of the 3 astronauts transfer into the lunar module, LM, and descend to the surface. Later, they use the LM's lower section as a launch platform to blast off using only the upper section. They then rendezvous with the 3rd astronaut, jettison the lunar module, and head back to Earth, returning to splash down in the ocean. There are countless potential points of failure. No rescue is possible if the LM misses its landing site or if its ascent engine fails to ignite. Testing continued. By October 1968, 11 years after the Soviets had launched Sputnik 1, Apollo 7 was ready for flight. Although not destined for the moon, Apollo 7 took astronauts Schirra, Isolé and Cunningham into Earth orbit to test the spacecraft hardware. It worked perfectly. Then, in December 1968, came the first actual journey toward the moon, Apollo 8, carrying astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. They soared away from Cape Canaveral, entering lunar orbit to circle the moon. Never before had humans traveled so far from Earth. They were not equipped to land, but they became the first to see the lunar far side with their own eyes. It was proof that traveling to the moon in a crewed spacecraft was indeed possible. Apollo 9, an Earth-orbiting mission, tested more of the Apollo equipment. Next, in May 1969, Apollo 10, with Stafford, Cernan and Young, entered lunar orbit and maneuvered low over the intended landing site. Standing here in the Science Museum, one can see the actual Apollo 10 command module, which carried the crew around the moon and allowed them to inspect the place where history would soon be made. That next historic mission was Apollo 11, charged with the task of landing humans on the moon. The designated site was the Sea of Tranquility, one of the moon's great dark lava plains. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would descend there in the LM, named Eagle, while Michael Collins orbited in the command module Columbia. If Armstrong and Aldrin intended to step onto the lunar surface, they required proper gear. Without an atmosphere on the moon, there is no air to breathe, and the lack of external air pressure would kill a person in under a minute. Each astronaut's suit had to remain pressurized, which made it bulky, although the moon's gravity, only 1/6 that of Earth's, helped offset the weight. Watched by millions on television worldwide, Apollo 11 lifted off on July 16, 1969. 3 days later, the spacecraft reached lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin then entered Eagle and commenced their descent. Armstrong piloted it by hand, a dangerous procedure with no second chances. As they approached the surface, their voices were broadcast across Earth. "Eagle, we got you now. It's looking good." "Roger, copy." "Eagle, Houston, you're a go to continue powered descent." Tension mounted while the lander drew ever closer to touchdown. Altitude 3,000 feet, 700 feet, picking up some dust. Finally, Armstrong's voice. "Engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." It was July 21st, 1969, in the early morning hours by British summertime, when Neil Armstrong climbed down the LM's ladder. The world held its breath as he uttered, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin later called the scene magnificent desolation. Although the sun lit the surface, the sky was utterly black. On the airless moon, it is always black, with no weather or wind to disturb the stillness. The 2 astronauts erected the American flag, well aware it could not flutter. They found walking intriguing in the reduced gravity. Motions were slow and deliberate. They deployed scientific instruments to continue sending data back to Earth, and they collected lunar rocks to bring home for further study. After just over 2 hours on the surface, they re-entered Eagle and prepared to leave. "Houston, guidance is okay. We're ready for liftoff." Using only the upper stage, the LM blasted off from the moon, leaving the lower half behind. Armstrong and Aldrin then rendezvoused with Collins and jettisoned Eagle. The trio returned to Earth in Columbia, splashing down in the Pacific. For many people, their achievement felt like a unifying moment. As one commentator noted, in some way when these two Americans stepped on the moon, the people of this world were brought closer together. That spirit, the spirit of Apollo, carried a sense of worldwide cooperation and peace. Although it was almost certain that the moon contained no life, there was still a remote possibility of bringing back unknown pathogens. So the Apollo 11 astronauts were quarantined upon their return. As expected, no contamination was discovered, so the quarantine procedure was discarded after Apollo 12. That second landing mission, Apollo 12, took place in November 1969, manned by Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. The Saturn V was struck by lightning during launch, but no critical systems were damaged. Their target area was the Ocean of Storms, the largest of the Lunar Maria. Surveyor 3, an unmanned probe that had landed there in 1967, remained intact on the surface. Mission planners wanted the astronauts to land near it and bring back pieces for analysis, requiring pinpoint accuracy. Conrad and Bean landed their LM Intrepid close enough to walk over to Surveyor 3, removing parts for study. A minor mishap occurred when Bean accidentally pointed the television camera at the sun, ruining it, but otherwise their mission ran smoothly. Apollo 13 was next, and nearly ended in catastrophe. The original crew consisted of Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Thomas Mattingly, until it was discovered they had been exposed to German measles. Lovell and Hayes were immune, but Mattingly was not, and he was replaced by Jack Swigert at the last moment. The chosen landing site was near the crater Fra Mauro, in the lunar region known as Mare Nubium, Sea of Clouds. The LM was dubbed Aquarius, and the command module Odyssey. Launch proceeded as normal, and people had grown blasé by then. Space travel almost seemed routine. Yet when Apollo 13 was about 178,000 miles from Earth, an incident took place. Mission Control asked for a simple task: stir up the cryo tanks. Moments later came the immortal words, "Houston, we've had a problem." There was an explosion in the service module, and the spacecraft lost most of its electrical power. Vital sections were blown away. Improvisation and calm thinking saved the crew. The lunar landing was cancelled, of course, and using the LM's engine, Apollo looped around the moon to head home. Had the explosion happened later, on the return flight, the astronauts would not have had Aquarius as a lifeboat module. In the end, Apollo 13 splashed down safely, but it served as a stark reminder that space travel is fraught with peril. A year later, Apollo 14 launched, commanded by Alan Shepard, one of the original Mercury 7. He had been grounded by an inner ear problem, but underwent surgery that restored his flight status. With him were astronauts Ed Mitchell and Stuart Roosa. Again, Fra Mauro was the landing objective. This time, they brought along a small moon cart for transporting equipment. Shepard and Mitchell walked farther than previous explorers, though they grew quite fatigued. Before they departed, Shepard famously hit the first golf shot on the moon, claiming the ball flew miles and miles and miles. One wonders if it will ever be found. Apollo 15 followed in July 1971, sending David Scott and Jim Irwin into the foothills of the lunar Apennine Mountains near Hadley Ryle, a massive crack in the surface, while their colleague Al Worden conducted experiments in the orbiting command module. This mission introduced another innovation: the Lunar Roving Vehicle, LRV, an electric moon car that allowed them to travel much farther on the surface. Delicate though it appeared, it worked perfectly in the moon's low gravity. Lunar dust was a problem, getting into everything, but fortunately was not excessively deep. As with previous missions, the ALSEP, Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package Station, was set up to transmit valuable data back to Earth. Apollo 16 launched in April 1972, taking John Young and Charles Duke down to the Moon's mountainous highlands, while Thomas Mattingly remained in orbit. Scientific experiments grew more ambitious with each mission. Finally came Apollo 17 in December 1972, the grand finale. Until this point, no fully trained geologist had been among the lunar explorers, though the astronauts had been well trained in geological methods. Now, Harrison Jack Schmitt, a professional geologist, flew alongside veteran astronaut Eugene Cernan and command module pilot Ron Evans. Their lunar module, Challenger, touched down in the Taurus-Littrow Valley near the edge of a mare, Lunar Sea. They again had an LRV, and Schmidt's expertise brought immediate benefits. While traversing a crater they nicknamed Shorty, Schmidt noticed unusual coloration. "There's orange soil here. It's all over the place." Excitement soared. Could this be evidence of recent volcanism? Analysis later revealed it to be ancient glassy beads, but it was a thrilling discovery nonetheless. All too soon it was time to depart. Cernan and Schmidt left behind an array of experiments, as all previous crews had done, and uttered words reflecting a hopeful future. "When we return this rock, we want to share it with the nations of the world. We hope that it will serve as a symbol of humankind living together in peace and harmony." With that, the last two people to walk on the Moon climbed back into Challenger. The ascent module's liftoff was captured on camera from the surface. Apollo 17 returned safely, and the program was complete. What ultimately did Apollo accomplish? Some critics argue that robotic spacecraft could achieve everything humans can. But computers cannot observe or think as a human does. Without astronauts, our knowledge of the Moon would be incomplete, lacking not only an understanding of lunar geology, but also important insights into our own planet, for the Moon is inextricably tied to Earth's history. Even now, the various experiments left behind by the Apollo missions continue to offer data about our solar wind, lunar seismology, and other phenomena critical to planetary science.